Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is having a fantastic lunch hour, or more particularly, a lunch break, and are joining us for our very, very first and inaugural new series at the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy called Lunch Nuggets. And perhaps we will explain the meaning to that at some point in a future session with us. But for now, because we have a really, really exciting guest, I want to leave as much time as possible to hear from him. But first, a little bit about this series. We just thought that there were so many different issues, both in the business world and the policy world, that intersected these days in Washington, D.C. And we thought, wouldn't it be nice to really cut through the noise and give everybody who's interested in broadband, high tech, and related policy issues an opportunity to have a little slice of information provided during a lunch break. So, not an overwhelming, detailed analysis of anything, but really speaking with very well known experts in their field and getting a little bit of a nugget of wisdom, if you will. So, to kick off today's session, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague at the center, Jennifer Fritchie, and she is going to introduce our speaker, and we'll get started. Again, thank you everybody else for joining, and we look forward to seeing you on future sessions, maybe even in person. Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you, Carolyn. I really appreciate it. Carolyn and I like to affectionately call ourselves the Lunch Ladies. So welcome to our first Lunch Lady seminar. And we're thrilled to welcome Mark Ganzi. Mark is CEO of Digital Bridge. And Mark and I have known each other, gosh, Mark, I don't know, 10, 15 years. And he's been really instrumental to me in my career when I was an analyst, kind of shaping the way the infrastructure is going to play in not only the wireless world, but also many other aspects of just communications in general. So Mark, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Carolyn. It's a pleasure to be here. And Professor Mayo, thank you for hosting me.
So Mark, why don't, for our audience, give us a little bit about your career background and your current role at Digital Bridge.
Yeah, so my background is, nobody goes to university to get their degree in digital infrastructure. So I think we're all a bit accidental tourists as we arrived here. But much like many of the kids that attend Georgetown, I went to get my bachelor's in science in economics at the Wharton School of Business, and really with an emphasis when I came out of college, Jennifer, focusing on real estate. That was really my background and my pedigree, and went to work for a real estate developer right out of college, and was really out, financing and buying distressed real estate was my initial job. But along that road, we always have these things in life that happen. I call them inflection points. And I think our careers are arcs, right? Inevitably, like planets orbiting, and sometimes something hits your arc and takes you into a different orbit. And for me, it was a Comcast Metrophone antenna lease ended up on my desk in 1994 on a building we had bought from the Resolution Trust Corporation. And Comcast was badgering my partner, my boss, the guy who owned the building. And he said, I can't make heads or tails of these technology things. I'll just give it to the young kid from Wharton. He'll figure it out. And that was it. That started my first collision with telecommunications and real estate. And I didn't understand how to read a rooftop antenna lease. I didn't even know what it was. But what was clear was they were using a part of the building that really was just collecting rain. It wasn't collecting revenue. And so I went to my Wharton network and I said, okay, who can I talk to that understands the cellular telephone business? And I ended up meeting a guy named Jeff Ginsberg. And so Jeff and I got to meet, and he said, oh, my partner Alex and I were building cellular networks. This was 1994. And they said, no, by the way, we're thinking about starting a business to help people think about, how to build this next generation real estate. But we need a guy that understands real estate. We understand cellular networks, but we don't understand real estate. And so we got in a room and we wrote a business plan. And, I went to the developer who I was working for. I said, I got good news and I got bad news. As he said, what's the good news? I said, the good news, I think I figured out the Comcast lease, and I think I have a great investment opportunity. He goes, well, what's the bad news? I said, the bad news is I'm quitting. And I'm going to go join Alex and Jeff, and we're going to build a startup that focuses on helping property owners how to deal with antenna leases. And at that time, remember, we're talking about analog cellular. We're talking about cell phones that look like a briefcase. And so we were just beginning to think about digital PCS. And we're beginning to see the inklings of, what could mobility do to the world beyond pagers and beyond big cell phones. And so I sort of blazed off into the unknown, which was, really coalescing the talents of telecom and real estate and figuring out how to look at that as a dedicated asset class. Keep in mind, this is 1994. No one was really thinking about cell towers. Nobody was thinking about data centers or fiber. And that's how my journey began. It was almost purely accidental. But the great part of that was I got to meet Alex Gellman and I got to meet Jeff Ginsburg, and which is sort of lesson two. Lesson one being you never know where something can come out of the blue and sort of hit your trajectory and move you over. But I think it's really interesting that you also need people, Jennifer. And part of my journey's been about people. We'll talk about that. But I'd be nowhere today without great partners and people that have really helped me along that journey. And that sort of serendipity moment of meeting Alex Gellman and Jeff Ginsburg in 1994 was a really important part of my career. So, I think that the key learnings here is, you'll never go to college for a degree in digital infrastructure. I think you got to go out and make it yourself. But finding this common space between the intersection of telecommunications and real estate is really how I've built my career. And 27 years later, I think I've been involved in the formation or the ultimate growth of now coming up on 29 companies in 27 years that I've either been the anchor investor or the CEO or the founder. And it's been such a tremendous journey. And so it's taken me from cell towers, rooftop antennas. We built our first fiber business in 1997 called Eureka Networks. We then went on to ultimately start GTP, then start DigitalBridge, and now really the largest owner and operator and investor in digital infrastructure around the world today. So it's been quite an arc for me, Jennifer, along that 27-year road.
Can I just interject with a quick question? And my role here is to just dumb everything down. And I play that role very convincingly. For those folks on the call, maybe even some reporters who hear the term inside the Beltway digital infrastructure, especially these days where there's a lot of discussion coming off the Hill and at various agencies and all over the newspapers about, quote, closing the digital divide. Could you just step back for a second for somebody who is really focused on policy but does not understand the technology of networks? When you say digital infrastructure, can you break that down and tell us exactly what comprises digital infrastructure for the layperson?
Sure. And I'll distill this and make it simple for a consumer. So look, if you're sitting at home right now, Carolyn, and we're doing this Zoom call, you're participating in digital infrastructure. So how do we break that down? Ultimately, it starts literally from your home and at your desktop. Your desktop is probably connected to a Wi-Fi node inside your house. That Wi-Fi node ultimately finds a router, and that router eventually finds a hookup to a cable company or an ISP. Now, if you're at a home residence or you're in a building, eventually that communications is going to go to a fiber optic cable. And that cable eventually, Carolyn, will go somewhere to a switch facility, typically either the switch facility for the cable co or for the ISP. Now, in your neck of the woods, your ISP would probably be Verizon or your cable company. I don't know who your cable company is, but let's just say, for example, it is Verizon. And ultimately, you'd hit a Verizon central office. And from that central office, Verizon will find a big data center, which will be what we call really an interconnection facility, where all of the fiber cables come in together and then they go back out. And that fiber optic cabling will go back out to a large data center somewhere where it's hosted in the cloud for Amazon, where mostly Zoom uses Amazon's infrastructure in the cloud. And so ultimately, your home connection has to find the cloud, the public cloud. And in that public cloud, ultimately, Zoom hosts their infrastructure with Amazon. And so at that same time, that application is hosted in the cloud, which really allows all of us to have this conversation. And then that comes back to a cloud data center, comes back to another interconnection facility that finds Jennifer's home, it finds my office here in Colorado, but we're all connected, right? We're connected because we're using fiber, we're using Wi-Fi offload, we're using an interconnection data center facility, we're using a hyperscale data center facility for Zoom, which is hosted by Amazon. And all of that is ecosystem. And that ecosystem is what enables this unique meeting to happen at the same time. And so, but it requires all of the components have to work. And most importantly, Jennifer will tell you this, it has to work at 5.9 standards, which means 99.999% of the time, the network has to stay up. And by the way, it's not just Verizon's cable network. It's not just the fiber to ultimately the internet connection facility, which could be run on Zayo, which then has fiber that runs to an Amazon data center, which could be Advantage. And then it ultimately runs all the way back to Jennifer's home. Each piece of that system is highly choreographed. There's redundancy, there's backup, there's switch facilities, there's network operation centers, there's fail safes in place. There's a lot of logistics that go into orchestrating this beautiful symphony. And that's what this is. This is a symphony where all of the parts of the ecosystem have to work together. Now, if you're doing this Zoom call on your phone, yeah, that's a BlackBerry, Jennifer. You can laugh at me. My kids do all the time. My kids laugh at me all the time. But think about it for a second. If you add the layer of complexity of a mobile phone, now you're touching everything, because this mobile phone talks to a cell tower, and that cell tower goes and finds a Verizon switch facility. And then we're recreating that same virtuous cycle again. But here's the key. You need all of it to work, right? You need the cell towers to work. You need the small cells to work. You need the fiber to work, and you need all the data centers to work. And they've all got to work seamlessly and without interruption. Now, our lives continue all day long, and you don't have any interruption in this, right? And we don't have a lot of interruption in our Zoom calls because we're all been working from home now for a year and a half. And there's bumps along the road. We all have little technology bumps, but guess what? During the pandemic, most of this worked, and it worked pretty good. And that's what we do for a living at DigitalBridge today. We own 22 companies around the world, and that's our job. Our job is to make sure this works, and you never know that it doesn't work. And if it doesn't work, then I'm in trouble and I'm out of a job.
I just want to thank you. I'm sure that was a rather tedious explanation for you to give because you are used to working with folks who already know all of that. But I cannot tell you how important it is for certainly folks inside the Beltway, on the Hill, and at agencies to really understand how the technology works. Because when they are suggesting policy fixes, to not understand how each of these piece parts is relevant and how important it is for each of those piece parts to work together simultaneously can lead to, if you don't appreciate that, can lead to some unexpected and negative outcomes from some policies, but we'll save that till later in the call. Jen, I did not mean to overtake your question. I just wanted to make sure people who were listening understood how complicated this is and how really I think it's kind of a miracle that it does work, and it does work so well. For right now, I'm actually somewhere in the wilds of South Central Virginia in Rappahannock County, and there is no, I was saying to Jen, I was driving back from the horse farm, and Verizon is actually out there putting us all into a single lane. Thank you very much. But they were trenching, and their big giant spools of fiber were rolling down the side of the highway. And my daughter said, "What is that?" And I said, "That's digital infrastructure." So thank you very much for that explanation.
What did I call it, Jennifer? Fiber to the farm, I think is what I called it. It's happening. It's happening. And that's part of bridging that digital divide, right? We've got to put connectivity out into the rural parts of America, and we've got to connect inner city schools where the average household income is below $28,000. This is where policy meets execution, and we'll talk about that because I've had a lot of experience working on the Hill for the industry. It's been a privilege to serve under President Obama in the Broadband Deployment Committee and working with the FCC and a GPI, and now working through Trump and now working through Biden. But there's a lot that public policy can do to help shape, inform, and ensure our competitive advantage in digital infrastructure as a country.
And maybe
I have detailed views on this.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue, Mark. I mean, clearly we're at a time this webinar is happening while DC is, really dealing with infrastructure bills right now and getting that over the finish line. How do you think DC can help the cause? What are your views on that?
Yeah, so we've had a lot of discussion around this at the FCC. I've been actually pulsed by Senator Warner. Now we've had a bunch of really good conversations about how to make this infrastructure bill really hit the target. And I think to your point, Carolyn, earlier about where do we get astray with DC and where do we get policy right? Here's my read of the room right now. We don't have an infrastructure problem in the US today. What we have is we have a deployment and an execution problem. which is how do we proliferate the infrastructure faster? How do we get it into secondary and tertiary communities? And then how do we ultimately bring a quality to how our students are learning? And are they getting the same internet speeds? Are they getting the same devices? And are they getting the same access to the right digital platforms so that we can enable all of our students to advance, at the same rate? And I think the initial drafts of this bill were a little bit off the mark, I would say, because we were more focused on subsidizing consumers. And we've got to get away from that. That's not the solution. The solution is how do we ultimately put the right tools and the right infrastructure in the hands so that citizens can access it and have equal access to it. I don't think it's government's responsibility to make sure that everybody has the same smartphone and the same plan. That's not what democracy is about. That's not what capitalism was laid on. But if we do have this unique window in time coming out of the pandemic where we can put capital to work in private and public partnership, where corporations are working with governments to facilitate infrastructure and to make sure that there's equality across that, I think that's where the focus should be. And I know Senator Warner agrees with me, and we've seen different iterations. You guys probably have watched the infrastructure bill change, the most recent partisan one being the biggest change, but you're starting to see some of that reflected in the verbiage now, which I'm happy about. And hopefully I've had an impact on that. I hope I have. And I want to continue to have an impact. I do think that, the older I've gotten and now coming into eventually my fourth decade in this industry, my role should be hopefully to advance the interests of our country and volunteer my time in serving our industry and serving the particularly FCC, which I've really enjoyed serving the FCC for a while, because I do think the FCC does a lot of good. I think it's one of those, sort of apolitical organizations that can do a lot of great things when they don't get weighed down in the partisan politics inside the Beltway. And one of the things I always liked about Ajit Pai is that he really was one of those people that played it right down the middle of the fairway. And I think that really was, given that he was one of the few chairmen of the FCC that actually was put in place by a Democrat, reinforced by a Republican, and then ultimately left his tenure with a new Democrat president in place, speaks to the fact that he was really working for all Americans. And I believe that the current sitting chair, I think she'll do the same. I really believe and hope, because she's been sitting on the committee for a while. My hope is, as a sitting member of the FCC, she's watched this and she's observed the nonpartisan nature of the work that we've been doing. And sitting on that broadband deployment board, there's literally 25 of the best executives in the country that really don't care about red or blue. They really look at digital infrastructure as being purple. And I think that's the important thing. We've got to use technology to advance our country. We've got to use it to advance our economy. And we can do that. We have an edge, but we can lose that edge super fast if we're not careful about how we do it. So I think the key headline coming out of this infrastructure bill has to be about partnership. And then the second piece to this, as Jennifer has observed for the last decade, is how do we build shared infrastructure faster? In other words, there should be a model where if we're working to build neutral host infrastructure, where all carriers and all cloud providers and all telcos and ISPs can participate that on an equal basis, that type of infrastructure should be not only accelerated, it should be promoted. And so we spent a lot of time going back in the early days. Jennifer, you probably recall this, in 2011 in the Rockefeller bill, where we put numerous provisions in that bill. And I worked on that bill really with the help of, it's now called WIA, but it was PCIA at the time, and working with the Cellular Telephone Industry Association with Tom Wheeler, and also working with Jim Takelet at that time, and Jay Brown. And we did a great job, I think. We found legislation that really accelerated 4G. And at that time, we were a laggard in 4G technology. And we passed all of the modern economies because we all went to the Hill together with industry, with politicians, and we said, look, this is good for Americans, right? We've got to create siting provisions, and we've got to create federal legislation that accelerates the proliferation of innovation and technology. We cannot have the impediment be government. Government bureaucracy shouldn't stand in the way of mobile infrastructure, small cells, digging fiber routes like in your street. We put in that bill, we put in a rule called Dig Once, which was a great rule. And so this is an evolution. And I think, we can use DC and weaponize it correctly to the benefit of all citizens, provided there's a clear path to deploy technology and to advance our economy.
So, Mark, along those lines, I would say it's really more of a policy/political fight than it is a technology fight. And that is it. I think there are some that are really more from the policy space that view future-proofing of networks needs to be fiber. And I think there is some concern in the context of these infrastructure bills, especially with respect to provisions for funding on broadband, that if you premise all of that on a theory that fiber is the only solution going forward, you, as a pragmatic matter, leave out huge swaths of the country/consumers who, for many reasons having nothing to do with either access or money, prefer mobile, and they're not looking to a fixed line. Now, we all understand fiber is incredibly important to a mobile network, so we understand that. But this idea that you will offer no subsidy dollars to any services that are provided except through a fiber build, I think is causing some people to wring their hands. So I'm just curious your thoughts on that general debate, and what do you see as a future-proof network across the country?
Well, look, there's no future-proofing any networks. Let's sort of throw that boogeyman out the window, because every 7 years we have what we call step functions in technology migration path. And I would argue, and Jennifer follows some of the vendors carefully, that 7 years, Jennifer, is probably compressing to 5 years now, just given how fast innovation is moving. And we're already talking about 6G, by the way, and we're proliferating already Wi-Fi 6. So this moves fast, right? Technology moves fast, and there's no proven one platform fits all. Certainly fiber is a great conduit, and it's a great means as a highway for trafficking information very quickly. But wireless is also incredibly effective, as you've pointed out. And in fact, I'd offer in tertiary markets and truly rural markets, when you think about the speeds of 5G, it's absolutely as fast and as effective as fiber. So when we get out into the sort of rural areas, getting out there and proliferating 5G technology will actually be cheaper. And the ultimate reliability of wireless, you could actually argue in natural disasters, wireless works better than wireline technology. Look at what happened in the hurricane in Houston. All wireline technology went down. All those data centers were underwater, and you lost complete connectivity. So the only way people stayed connected and the only way people sent signals to emergency responders was wireless. Right? FirstNet operates on wireless. Community firefighters and police officers operate on 220 megahertz, which is push to talk, classic Motorola technology. So wireless is actually more reliable than wireline, but it is so easy because of the way we are set up politically and the way that we've set up our districts. When you get out into some of these rural areas where you've got districts and you've got congressmen who are looking to lobby for dollars because the best way that they can get votes is through rural telephone cooperatives, getting those subsidies and saying, look, this is a great way that we can take from the government to replace our copper with fiber, and we can do it under the auspices of the broadband bill. That's silly. That should not be a public policy decision. That's where government goes too far and is ultimately taking over, when really that should once again be a private public partnership, right? Look at Pioneer Telephone Cooperative in Oklahoma, by example. They own Pioneer Cellular, someone we've been building infrastructure for a long time. Pioneer works. They're a great telephone company. They're a rural telco. They've got wireline and they've got wireless. And if their CEO were on this call with us right now, he'd say both work. But we have a pragmatic approach to how we deploy the technology, because we have a responsibility to our citizens inside this cooperative to ultimately deliver value for the stakeholders. That's a great way to think about it, right? Really smart CEOs that run these telecommunications firms understand that technology is just a series of arrows that sit in your quiver. How you choose to shoot those arrows is up to you, but ultimately the decision should be to shoot the arrows in a way where you've got redundancy, you use fiber, you use wireless, you use both of those technologies. And at the end of the day, there's never going to be a magic bullet. There's nothing is ever going to be future proof. Both wireless and wireline technology actually work harmoniously together to keep our economies moving. And I've been pushing this as well. I think it is, and you're starting to see some of the scuttle come out of these debates where the wireless industry is saying, look, time out. You can't just give all the money to the telcos. If you're going to give money out, it's got to be done on an equal basis, because look at what we just paid you guys for spectrum.
Right.
Jennifer followed the 5G spectrum auctions. I think the number in total for C-band was just under 100 billion in total. So the wireless guys are going, wait a second, time out. I just gave you guys $90 billion. And now you're going to give all that money to the wireline guys for fiber? Help us out too, right? It's a logical argument. And then the cloud guys get it all for free. So that's a whole nother can of worms that we're going to have to tackle.
That'll be Nuggets number 2.
Yeah, that's one where I do have a little bit of sympathy for the wireless guys and the wireline guys, is that, in terms of the free ride that the content players get and the free ride the cloud guys get on infrastructure, that's going to be a big issue. That'll be an issue for the next decade.
You have the mic on that. I know we only have maybe a minute or two left, but we
only have a minute or two left.
A minute or two left. I know.
We have to do like session 2 and session 3.
I think we might need to change the name from Nugget to some sort of sandwich, because I don't think Nugget quite covers it.
This is like a foot-long submarine,
right?
Right. So
one of the other political issues is, okay, I take your point. Subsidizing, direct to the consumer, and in your view, not the best idea to do this. But what you do have is a discussion over, right now, the system for subsidizing is based on an increasingly diminished supply of revenue, the way it's defined in the Communications Act, and it's simply not sustainable. I think the contribution factor is up around 31%, which is ridiculous. Right. And we've been trying this system for many years, and yet we still have this digital divide. So obviously it's not working. One of the discussions right now is, what if we were to broaden the base of entities that contribute into some sort of subsidy, whether that happens under the auspices of the Federal Communications Commission or whether it happens somewhere else, it is, to be determined. Most people aren't getting off the dime in terms of should we broaden the base or not. So in terms of your idea, your thinking on the free ride issue, not that implicates a USF contribution, but I think people are beginning to step back and say, well, wait a minute, your entire business model seemed to be premised on robust digital infrastructure, and yet you are really having nothing to do with it. So is that really fair? Does that really make sense? And so since you raised this issue of a free ride, I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Well, it's not a total free ride, but it's close to the akin of free ride based on revenues, right? So if you start to put the OTT players and you put the content, which is content, and you put the cloud guys into that, and if they're funding into the universal coverage fund, you'd find you get a much bigger contribution. I mean, look at what the cloud guys are making in top line, and look at what's happening with the traditional telcos. If I'm the CEO of Windstream, I sit here and go, well, this isn't fair, right? These guys are making billions of dollars in the cloud. We provide that infrastructure, and we're losing money. Our revenues are going like this. Amazon's revenues are hockey sticking like this. And we're the dumb plumber, right? We're the guys that have to provide that mission critical plumbing. So something has to give. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about what do you do to the cloud players? Do you deregulate them? Do they have an infra co? Do they have an operating co? Do they need to be broken up? I mean, these are legitimate conversation pieces that we're going to have over the next 10 years. And I think, in all fairness to the traditional wireline guys and the fiber players, they do get a certain amount of revenues from Google and Facebook and Amazon and Microsoft. We do at Zayo. We own one of the largest private dark fiber players in the US. But those revenues from those guys aren't growing that fast, to be clear. Most of our revenues in the fiber business are coming from the wireless guys, because we're taking that fiber out to small cells, we're taking it to towers, we're taking it to buildings. And so something will have to change. And I think, a textbook definition of what the FCC's purview is and what it isn't, that's a good place to start, because certainly the cloud guys and the content guys definitely need to be in that discussion, and they need to be paying their fair share into it. I think that's what's fair, and I think that's what's reasonable. They certainly have the capability to do it, and they have the money to do it.
Not even a rounding error, I don't think.
No.
Jen, I have really talked too much, so
Not at all. No, Mark, I guess maybe just as you have the final question, what do you need from DC to help your job? I mean, you have every tool in the toolkit to drive this. You have fiber, you have wireless towers, you have small cells, et cetera, et cetera. More spectrums obviously coming, but what can DC do to help your cause? If there was one specific ask.
You know, I'll speak for our industry. I'll speak for all the digital REITs out there and my peers. I think one of the things that we often complain about, Jennifer, is just the red tape. Red tape in siting, red tape in ditch digging, tower erection, small cell proliferation, permits for data centers, will serve letters for data centers. That's a big one.
Okay.
And ultimately creating the right incentives for the good actors and creating the right penalties for the bad actors. I think these are important things that we need to be debating. And then also adding to that topic of good actors, what kind of incentives can we put in place? And I give President Obama a lot of credit. He did this pretty well. There were a bunch of credits put in place for telecommunication sites that used wind and that used solar and other forms of renewable energy. We have a serious crisis in our country and our planet around ESG. I think you guys have known that my commitment to getting Colony, DigitalBridge now, net zero 2030, we're well down the road on that. And we're working really hard to create renewable and sustainable sources of energy for all of our digital infrastructure. That is going to be what this generation, us as business leaders, that's our call to arms over the next 10 years. And DC has got to be a part of that discussion. And the good actors need to have the right set of incentives to continue to invest in clean energy adjacent to data centers. Solar panels at the bottom of cell towers, putting in small wind turbines on small cells to fuel it, or putting small solar panels. Companies that do the right thing and do right by the planet should absolutely have a dollar for dollar tax break incentive scheme in place so that we're investing for our children's future. That's really important. And I'd like to put my energy and time into that to create the right set of, create the right framework, but then once we get the framework right, create the right incentives and create the right penalties too for the people that are not helping or contributing to the greenhouse gas emissions. The ones that are putting it back on the right track should be rewarded. Those that aren't should be penalized. And there should be a bright line test on this, I think.
And I could tell from your analyst day last week, it's clearly more than just talking points for you guys. And so I really
it's table stakes. By the way, it's no longer talking points.
Right.
The good CEOs have a framework. They've got the metrics. They've done their carbon footprint. They know where they're going. We've done that work.
Yes.
And I would say we're at the head of the class. In the digital REIT space, us and probably Digital Realty are at the head of the class on this work.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, I know I definitely want to follow up on that point. Maybe for another discussion, maybe not making you the second nugget or foot long, as it were, but certainly there's what you've highlighted during this conversation. I want to thank you very, very much. Is how many different issues are raised in a general conversation about digital infrastructure that are very relevant to the broader U.S. economy. So again, thank you for connecting those dots. And Jen, over to you to close us out.
Mark, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining us. Again, this is the first of what we think will be a great seminar series, and we look forward to joining you in the future, or you joining us. Thank you. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Carolyn.
Absolutely. Great to see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Jen.
Bye.